Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to our first spring talk of 2023. And I'm delighted that we have Alison Kinnaird from Scotland speaking to us this evening. Born in Edinburgh, Alison studied Archaeology and Celtic Studies at Edinburgh University, but through a chance encounter on holiday, discovered glass engraving and hasn't looked back since. She opened her own studio aged just 24 in Edinburgh High Street, and today she is an internationally renowned glass artist with work in many public and private collections throughout the world, including the V&A, the Corning Museum of Glass in New York, and the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. Alison uses wheel engraving, an ancient technique which has been practiced for more than 2,000 years. But as well as working with these traditional methods, she likes to combine modern technologies in her work, including LED lighting, to create glass artworks with contemporary relevance, which maintain the special character and unique qualities of glass. Her work ranges from very small, intimate pieces to major stained glass windows in historic buildings. And I'm really excited to hear more about her body of work this evening from the artist herself. So Alison, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to speak to us. I will hand over the Zoom webinar to you. Please share your screen, and I'll come back later for questions.
I'm now unmuted. I'm glad to be here. I'm delighted that the Stained Glass Museum has asked me to give a talk. I'm an engraver, and you know, engraving isn't always associated with stained glass windows. So it's very nice to be invited to show what I've done in that sort of area. So I'm going to take a quick look through where I work and how I work, and then go on to some of the windows and the larger architectural projects that I've been involved with. So the first image, and actually it's quite nice to show it because everybody seems to be from in snowy areas, and this is a picture of where I live and work in the summertime. It's a village called Temple. It's a very historic village. It was the headquarters of the Knights Templar in Scotland, and you can see in the right hand side the ruin of the Templar church. And my late husband and I have lived and worked in the new church, which is dated from 1832. And it's been a wonderful place to live and work and create. Now I'm going to try to move on with my images, and I'm not getting the option to do that. Yes, I am. There we are. So I'm a wheel engraver, and I thought I would show this image because it really demonstrates some classic wheel engraving here, but also combines it with LED lighting, which is how I bring in the color. And that's been one of my main directions of my work, to combine the very old technique with the new techniques. And this piece is called Bed of Roses, and it's also linked with a poem that Robert Burns wrote called My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, but he ends it by saying, ah, she left the thorn wi' me. So there's always a little bit of sadness going on there. And Robert Burns himself was a little bit of a glass engraver, and he used to engrave his poems onto windows when he was staying somewhere. This one dates from 1787 and is rather nicely engraved with a diamond. So it's nice to have that kind of link. This is where I work, and we were lucky that the church, it didn't have stained glass in the windows. It was rather, they were just very plain windows. We were lucky that actually the original glaziers have engraved their initials and dates on the windows. So there's some very nice links with the past and those people who created it. You don't really need much space for wheel engraving. I work on the landing at the top of the stairs in front of this window, and the space is about 2 meters by 2 meters. I've got 2 little lathes, and I've got lots of lovely light coming in and a beautiful view beyond. This is another view of the lathe. Wheel engraving is done with copper or diamond wheels that are turned on spindles. You slot them into a lathe, a little lathe, and we now have an electric motor which turns the lathe. In the past, obviously, they would have had to have pedaled to power the lathe, and it must have been quite difficult to keep your hands completely steady at the same time as pedaling. So we all appreciate the fact that we now have electricity to power the lathe. But you use a wide range of wheels. They all have different profiles. They go from about 4 inches in diameter down to pinheads, and you just wear them down gradually. So over years, each wheel will be used right to back down to the spindle again, and then have a new wheel put on it, which we do ourselves. This is me working at it. With the copper wheel engraving, you work from underneath the wheel. It's not like cutting, which is usually down from above. And so you can't actually see the cut at the moment that you make it, which sounds a little bit impractical, especially since copper doesn't actually cut glass. So you apply a mixture of carborundum powder mixed up with oil. You can see it just down below the lathe there. And you dip that onto the wheel, and that's what actually does the grinding. But, you know, if a technique has lasted for 2,000 years, there must be something special about it. And I think that it has got a particular delicacy and quality of modeling that you don't get with anything else. Oh, no, we don't want that. We want to move on. This is an example of a very ancient form of engraving, which was done basically the same way. This is a Babylonian seal, and you can see on the left-hand side there's a semi-precious stone, or perhaps even a piece of bone, engraved in much the same way as we do nowadays, and it was rolled onto wax to make an impression. So, as I say, a technique that has lasted that length of time and been used in many different ways has a great deal to offer people. I'll show a couple of my pieces now. This is a piece called Leopard Lady, and it shows you can use the engraving in a number of different ways. As you do the engraving, it's frosted, and you have this lovely texture of skin and muscle. But then you can polish it, which is what I've done with the leopard. You can polish out the frosted surface till it's shiny again, and then you can engrave over that. So it uses lots of different textures as you go. And this piece is only, about 10 centimeters tall. So it's quite nice to be able to give a different impression of the scale of things that you work on. People find it difficult to tell the scale from photographs sometimes. I get my inspiration from, quite often from my studies. As you heard, I did a degree in Celtic Studies and Archaeology. And I have to tell you, that was after I had been turned down for art college. Initially, I thought I would go to art college, and when I was turned down, it was rather a blow. But in fact, it turned out very well, because I don't think I would have discovered the glass department. And glass is my medium, and I just find it very rewarding to work with it. It's by far the most versatile of any of the media, I think. So I take my inspiration from all sorts of things. This piece is called Istra, and it's about the female condition. It's about rolling stones away from tombs. It's about rolling eggs down hills at Easter. And it's got a lot of different meanings in it. And I like to hear at exhibitions when people are discussing my work. Sometimes they come up with things that I hadn't seen in it myself. So it's always quite rewarding to hear that too. when you're engraving, you're actually carving into the glass quite deeply. And sometimes I've used this to cast off. You can see in the left-hand block here, I've cast with resin. Resin was filled with aluminium powder so that it looks like metal, but it's cast off the figure on the reverse of the clear block. And then that block has been engraved again. So it gives you a good idea of how deeply the engraving goes. It's kind of like low relief sculpture, but in reverse. And none of the other engraving techniques, I think, go quite as deep as that. Now, engraving suffers very often in exhibitions because galleries really are not designed to show clear glass with engraving on it, because they're almost always white boxes with no windows and with the light from the center onto the walls. And I'm afraid that's the best way to kill engraving stone dead. So in self-defense, after I've been to a number of exhibitions where my glass has been put in against a dark wall and you can't see the engraving at all, I started experimenting with putting lighting into the glass. And first of all, I started off with using optical fiber lighting. And now I've moved on to LEDs, which are wonderful to work with these days. You can do amazing things. This is a piece that is called Streetwise, and it shows some of the different effects that you can get with, this is actually using optical fiber lighting. It's lit from below and the glass is layered. Because the other thing about wheel engraving is you can only work on pieces that are about 40 centimeters big in any direction. Because of the lathe being fixed, you couldn't get to the center of the piece of glass otherwise. So 40 centimeters is about your limit for doing wheel engraving. And I wanted to expand the canvas, as it were, that I was working on, and started layering the pieces of glass on top of each other. So these are panels of glass. I think that the whole installation is about 2.5 meters long, and it deals with urban subjects. This is the other half of it. One half is in the Alexander Tutzek Foundation in Munich, and the other half in Dundee Art Gallery and Museum. And the shadows behind are actually the shadows of the engraving, which I photographed and had printed to hang as a backdrop behind the glass. Because once again, the background to engraved glass is very important. And you just never know where it's going to be shown against. So I like to provide a backdrop in quite a few cases, which adds to the entire installation anyway. So these figures are actually a combination of sandblasting and wheel engraving. You can see where the sandblast is because there's a certain amount of shading involved there. And then any details that look three-dimensional are done with the wheel. And these are engraved, and then they're placed, as I say, layered on top of each other, so that you have to plan very carefully where each bit of the engraving is going to go. And then the lighting catches the engraving from below. Each color is trapped in one layer of glass, so that if you see 3 colors in a section, that means there are 3 layers of glass against each other at that point. When I'm doing wheel engraving, the sort of classic wheel engraving, I find that I always found it was very difficult put clothes on my figures. In fact, they were almost always nude. For many, many years, I only did nude figures. But when I started combining them with the sandblasting and the wheel engraving, I found that you could get a much looser, more painterly effect. And it allowed me to deal with more up-to-date, more modern subjects in a more comfortable way. And the dress that you could put on the figures was modern, but wasn't tied to any particular period. So I found that it broadened my artistic work in many ways. So these are all details of the streetwise pieces. I do like graffiti, by the way. I sort of collect graffiti as I travel around. Now, you can do exciting things with the LEDs these days. This piece is called Passing Through, and it's about how we pass through each other's lives. Again, I'm using the shadows behind to give a backdrop, but also in this piece, in one layer of glass, I've engraved a figure in almost like an animation, and it lights up in sequence so that it actually walks through the piece. And you don't see it at first, you just see the main figures, and then suddenly a figure will walk through a piece of glass. So it's really, quite exciting, the things you can make happen with the LEDs, because they can be programmed to do nice things. I believe that I could, if I wanted to make something happen, say on the 3rd of October in the year 2053, at 10 o'clock in the morning, I could make that happen. So perhaps I'll organize some sort of miracle in a church, will surprise everybody. Now, as I said, glass engraving is normally done, wheel engraving is normally done on a small scale, but you can take it to a larger scale if you have the right equipment and the right assistance, because here I have probably the largest single pieces of glass that I've worked on. These are 2 panels, one on top of the other, which I was commissioned to engrave with birch trees for a client in Beverly Hills. Now, you can imagine I can't handle that sort of piece of glass myself. These ones weighed 200 pounds each panel. So I worked with Derek's Glass Studios in Germany. And for anybody who hasn't been there, you need to go and visit Derek's Glass Studios. They're one of the few studios that actually work specifically with artists to realize their projects. And I took a very large flexible drive machine to Germany, and I stayed there for a couple of weeks, and I engraved solidly for 2 weeks, and these were what turned out. And you can see they're quite large pieces of glass. They're about 15 feet high, and that's Manfred, who is just putting them in place. So they're in the studio at Derek's at that point. I did volunteer to go and install them in Beverly Hills, but unfortunately, they already had their own art handlers and lighting designers and goodness knows what. So I didn't get to go to Beverly Hills at that point. So now I'm moving on to the actual windows. And the first window that I was commissioned to do on a large scale was a window for Dornoch Cathedral. And I was given a phone call from the widow of the organist and choir master. He had been there for many years and he had sadly died, and she wanted to commemorate him. And there were a couple of blank windows in Dornoch Cathedral. Now these are about 3.5 meters tall. That's about 15 feet tall. And it's a very ancient cathedral in the north of Scotland, very beautiful building. And it has got a huge range of stained glass in it, dating from different periods. And they were very welcoming and encouraging to create something that would be contrasting and interesting and new in the cathedral itself. So I decided that I would do a window which was based on praise, because his role had been so important in the music of the church. So it's got the figure with its hands raised, either conducting a choir, if you like to take it that way, or in praise. I also have the lines which represent the staff of music, and the little lenses that are set into it are representing notes of music. I was actually very careful to make sure that it was on the north side of the cathedral, because, you know, if you're using lenses in a building, you have to be careful that the light isn't going to come through. One wouldn't want to set the 11th century cathedral on fire at any point. So you have to consider all the practicalities. So on either side of the figure there are figures singing, there are choristers. And again, it's done with a combination of sandblasting and wheel engraving. And then at the bottom, there are musicians playing. I'm involved in music myself, especially Scottish traditional music. And so I wanted to bring that in as well. And it always annoys me when artists don't get the technical side of instruments correct. So I can guarantee that this is a correct set of bagpipes. And the banner which hangs down from them has got 3 stars on, which represent Dornach. I was very pleased afterwards that I was commissioned again to do 2 other smaller windows for the cathedral. You know, congregations are quite often rather difficult to work with because they all have very specific and very deeply felt feelings about what's appropriate in their building. So if you're asked back to do some more work in the same building, it's quite an honor. So I was asked to do 2 more windows, and I think that I don't know, somebody can set me right if I'm wrong on this one. I think they're maybe the only cathedral windows with jellyfish in them. These are my jellyfish, and they appear in the north transept windows. It was to commemorate a couple, an elderly couple who had died, who visited very often there, and who both loved to dance. And so I suggested that we take the theme, Let All Creation Dance. And we have male and female figures. We have dawn and dusk. And I've put in a selection of the flora and fauna that are local to the area. So I really enjoy just doing some research and trying to find things that people will find interesting and be able to relate to. And there are also some tiny things hidden in these windows, by the way. I like it to do these things so that they're not always obvious. It's a little bit like the medieval craftsman. So there are a couple of little spiders engraved, for instance, that sometimes we ask the children to see if they can find. So after that, my next big project was with the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. Now, I had been invited to do a portrait for the portrait gallery a couple of years before. The portrait gallery commissions about four portraits every year, and they have a particular theme. And then they put the sitters, they have chosen the sitters, and they put them together with a suitable artist. And the year that I was asked to do a commission was when the theme was nature. and wildlife. And I was asked to do a portrait of a gentleman called Roy Dennis, who is very well known in the natural world. He was instrumental in bringing the sea eagle and the red kite back to Scotland. So it was difficult to decide how to do a portrait for such an important institution. And I decided to do it in a way which you can only do in glass. So I used 4 layers standing against each other and took his silhouette of his head and created a tunnel down which the birds are flying. Roy Dennis, thankfully, from my point of view, had a very distinguished profile and interesting hair. And so he was a very nice sitter to work with. But after that portrait, it was obviously again well received, because I was asked to do the donor window when the gallery underwent quite a major refurbishment. And the gallery is just an astonishing building anyway. It's the most beautiful building. It was built in Victorian times. This is the entrance hall, and you can see it's quite spectacular. So to be asked to put something which is going to be permanently on view in the gallery itself is quite an honor. On one of the stairs, this is the windows that I was asked to work on. On one of the stairs, you can see the original donor window, which has got 24 Victorian gentlemen, all with varying amounts of facial hair. And at the top is Queen Victoria. And you can see just beyond the scaffolding, you can see the blank window beyond that. And I was asked to fill that. And the only request was that I keep the same circle and square pattern to reflect the original window. But apart from that, I was allowed to do any color or any treatment that I wanted. Now, it was quite difficult to decide how to treat it, because when you engrave on clear glass and it's held up against, it's quite high up there, you're looking against a pale grey sky, usually in Scotland, especially today when it's snowing, but usually the light is not very strong. And engraving just the frosted effect on clear glass, it tends to disappear. So I had to work out a new method of treating this. And what I came up with was to use flashed glass. So this is a practice portrait actually of myself that I did as an experiment. And I found that if I did the modeling on the back of the glass, and then did the shading through the colored side, you can shade back very, very gently so that you get the highlights. And the modeling shows through as well. It shows through as a 3-dimensional effect. So it was a very strong effect, and you could see it even at a distance. It was very strong. So that was how I chose to treat the portraits. And it involved 13 portraits. The reward for the very wealthy and generous donors who were giving money to the refurbishment was that they should get their portraits in this window. So you can imagine it was quite a high pressure commission to do portraits of these people. So I did sittings with almost all of them. This was one of the people. This is Carol Murray. She travels between Hong Kong and London, and she asked if her rings could be included, because she comes from a family who have had a lot of contact with jewelry. So I did drawings of her, and then I translated that into glass. And this is portrait of Carol and the one of her husband, Alan, which is down below. and these were set into the window. Now the window, because I don't construct stained glass windows, I can't do leading and I can't install them. I worked with another wonderful artist called Patrick Ross Smith. And Patrick used to live very close to me, about 3 miles away from me, and we'd worked together in a couple of other projects. Patrick, unfortunately, from my point of view, but very nicely from his, he relocated to the islands of Shetland, which are off the very, very north of Scotland. And he used to travel up and down, first on the boat, and then bringing his motorcycle down. And so that window travelled up and down between the south of Scotland and the Shetland Isles on the back of a motorcycle, all in little bits, but very safely. He assured me he was a very safe rider. So I'm glad to say it all got there in one piece when it was necessary. These are the bits that I was working on, and they're all laid out on the floor there, and the window is coming together in all in its different pieces, waiting to be leaded together. And this is a section of the window which has got most of the portraits in it. And as I say, most of these were done from life, and it was a very wonderful project to work on. At the top was the portrait of the Queen. Unfortunately, I didn't get a sitting with her because the gallery asked whether I would like one, and apparently applied for one, but it was her Jubilee year and she was already booked up for sittings. But you can see this is the way that I engraved it. First the back there with the modelling, and then putting in the shading to bring out the highlights very gently, and then that's the final one. That's the window installed. And as you can see, it's a strong effect, but you can get some beautiful detail amongst that. And then this is the final window with the Queen at the top there. And apart from the portraits, of course, there were some charitable donors and trusts and who were involved. And rather than having logos, I said I would rather not. In fact, I refused to do any logos. I suggested we offer them a bouquet of flowers in thanks, and they could choose the flowers that they wanted. And because the portrait gallery has got a sort of floral theme running through it, round the tops of the pillars and so on, it was very nice to carry it on. And in the background there, I think you can just see a little drift of figures, rather abstract figures coming down the pale blue background, and they represent the people of Scotland, because there was a lot of public money involved as well. So after that, my next project was for a church in Kent. And this is a very old church, which dates back to Anglo-Saxon times. And a donor very kindly offered to give them money to build a pentice, that's the little building down the sides, which they could use for weddings and so on. And I was commissioned to do windows, 2 windows and doors for this. Now, this demanded a different sort of treatment, because we worked out that if we used leaded glass, the doors would have to be protected on both sides with the toughened glass, so that, because you couldn't push on it otherwise. And that would mean 3 layers of glass plus leading, and that would make them so heavy that they couldn't be moved. So I discussed this with Derek's, and we worked out a different way of doing it. We were going to laminate a jigsaw of glass onto toughened glass. And normally you can't, the accepted wisdom is that you can't laminate engraved glass, because the frosted surface disappears whenever you put liquid on it. It goes transparent again. But I found that if you laminate it on the other side, on the coloured side, it actually works very well, and you keep both the modelling and the shading that you get with going through the flashed layer of colour. So this is me drawing out the cutting lines at Derek's Glass Studios. They cut the glass for me. They sent it to Scotland in bits. That's the bit that you just saw me drawing out there, the Madonna and Child. And if you see the lower circle there, that is going to turn out like that when it's engraved. It's engraved on both sides so that you get modelling and you get the shading as well. And this was all done with the wheel. So it took several months to do each part of the design. This is it put together more, a detail of the nativity window. And this is the window being installed. It's actually about 3 meters wide, so it was a very large project altogether. And this is a final view of the window. And I just love the effect that you can get. And again, it's actually quite good using the coloured glass, because there were some roofs and things at different angles in the background just outside this particular window. And if you had had clear glass, they would have been a bit intrusive, I think. But with the coloured glass, the design is what stands out. So, moving on to the doors, because the church is dedicated to Saint Mary, it was taking the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Resurrection as the three themes. So this is the doors, 2 doors, and you can see the very old Anglo-Saxon door there, which is open. These are the doors from inside. And again, made up of a jigsaw of glass, so that each part was engraved separately and then laminated onto the toughened glass. I have to say that Derek's cut the glass absolutely beautifully. I mean, it takes incredible skill to cut the glass like this. I had said to them, oh, well, I can engrave that bit. And they were saying, no, we can cut that for you. So they did. You couldn't see any gaps. It was just beautifully cut so that each piece fitted perfectly into the next. And this is a detail of the resurrection window. I like putting in little secret details, as I say, and into the resurrection window, I put these daffodils, which are symbols of rebirth and hope. And this is the resurrection window. And in this case, again, it was a slightly unusual request. The congregation didn't want to lose the view beyond, because it looks out across the Romney Marshes to another little church on a hill far beyond. And I had said to them, well, honestly, I may be talking myself out of a job here, but I think that it would be quite good if you just left the window clear. However, they said they did want a design in it, so I designed it so that the coloured glass frames the view, and it depicts the tomb and the angel announcing the resurrection of Christ. So I've used this technique again in some of my own work. These are what I call my timepieces. These are panels of glass, which are about 1.5 meters tall. And they're on the theme of time. And they're, again, using this technique of engraving both sides of the glass, double engraving it, as it were, and then laminating that on. So this piece is called The Astronomer, and she is looking through her telescope at the vast and timeless universe beyond. The next one is quite a contrast. This is the the subway photographer. And this piece is about how quickly we pass through each other's lives. I remember hearing a radio program, which has always stuck with me, about how in the 14th century, the average person met 100 people in their lifetime. And I just, when you think about that, that's just incredible, because for us, you know, people pass you by, 100 people in just a few seconds, really. And that's what this one is about all the people who pass by him in the click of a shutter. This is how I stand them up, but they could be used as a window or a door. And these pieces I have in my studio at the moment. You can put a light panel behind them, or you could set them into a window or a doorway. So I'm hoping that maybe a photographic studio or something like that might like to take this as a window. I think it would be quite appropriate. The figures, the faces on that one, by the way, came from a time I was in New York, where I spent quite several months every year in New York over the past few years. And I used to take a post-it pad in the subway with me and collect people's faces. They didn't know they were being drawn. You just had a few seconds to catch a likeness, and then they got off the subway. But then I could expand that into a proper little portrait. And that's how that jigsaw of glass, the jigsaw of portraits, is behind the photographer there. And the third panel is called Graffiti Artist. And he looks very contemporary, but the motifs behind the graffiti motifs are actually adapted from motifs on the Neolithic tombs of Scotland and Ireland. These are star signs and calendars, and they were trying to make sense of their world, just as we are as well. So again, this is one of my panels, double engraved and laminated onto the toughened glass. And it's on the theme of time again, but in a different way. And I'm just going to finish off with two projects, which are not actually windows, but they are sort of large projects as far as I'm concerned, and unfortunately rather relevant. I did an army of 60 soldiers, 60 glass soldiers, each nearly half a meter high, and lit with LED lighting again. And this army toured around Scotland to about 25 different venues. It started off in the Scottish Parliament and then went to National Trust properties and galleries and museums, all with a connection with war. And each soldier is an individual, and there are some civilian figures in there as well, because war doesn't just affect the military, but each one is unique. And it was a good way, I felt, of commenting on how fragile life is in time of war. And the last images I'm going to show you are of my final piece, which was completed just in the past few months, really. I was hearing the names of the battles fought in Ukraine, and it started me thinking about battles fought throughout time and throughout the world. And I'm afraid you don't run out of names. And I started engraving these names on pieces of glass that have got a silhouette of a soldier cut out. And gradually the figure is overtaken by these names and subsumed into them. So this is about 3 meters long, this piece. And the last image that I'm going to show is just a detail of that. I put a small child in the center just to remind ourselves of the humanity that's involved in this, but also that there's a small child inside every soldier as well. So it has got the double meaning. So I hope that that has given you some idea of some of the projects that I've been involved in, that wheel engraving has got a huge potential for expressing all sorts of ideas. And although it's a very old technique, it's got amazingly modern applications as well, if you want to express things that are relevant to today. So thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has questions, I'm very happy to respond.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that brilliant expose of your work. I'm in awe at the detail, the layers, and just the kind of impressions, and really wishing that we were seeing them in 3D. So apologies to everyone. The photos are brilliant. But
you know, everybody who is involved in glass knows that you don't get the full impression of glass until you see it in real life.
Exactly.
So if you like a photo of glass, it always looks better in real life, I think. So
yeah, so we must go and
you have to come and see it. Yes.
Yeah. And I might actually ask after this talk, Alison, ask if you have a list of your work where places where people can go, because I think lots of people want to go and find them. I know we visited Kent last year on a museum trip and did not go to that church in the Romney Marshes, but a wonderful example, and I will definitely seek it out next time I'm there.
Yeah.
Also fantastic for the Stained Glass Museum, that obviously normally the collection predominantly is traditional leaded stained glass made of coloured glass, but to think really interesting to strip back to what you can do with clear glass, and the surface, and think about the texture, but also you have this wonderful way of playing with the light and working on coloured flash glass, which brings these two techniques together so beautifully. So thank you so much. If you have questions, please do pop them in the Q&A and I will field some to Alison. We've got one from Linda, who says, fabulous work, Alison, thanks so much. Where can we see the soldiers piece that you showed at the end? So I think this is the piece with the Ukraine names that you had just finished.
As I say, I completed it not that long ago. It's actually under discussion at the moment. It's for an exhibition that's likely to happen in the Scottish Parliament in the summer. But at the moment, I have it set up in my studio. So if anybody wants to visit Temple, they're very welcome.
Thanks, Alison. A technical question about the LED lights. Someone asks, are you concerned by the durability of the lights, i.e. what happens when the LEDs stop working if they're in the piece?
Well, I always design them so that you can get access to the LEDs so that they could be replaced if necessary. Now, they do have a shelf life, an active life of 10 to 15 years of continuous use. That's what the estimate is. And, you know, that's quite a substantial life anyway. So sometimes I worry about it a little bit, but then I look at some of the other artworks made by other people, you know, in different mediums, and I think, what am I worrying about? You know, I mean, really, I have designed them so that a knowledgeable person could put in alternative forms of lighting if necessary. So in the end, they would be, they could be renovated. Oh, and by the way, I should say that somebody, your last question was, where could the war piece be seen? And both this army of 60 soldiers and the war piece will, I hope, eventually find a suitable home, but they're not exactly domestic pieces. So they have been touring and giving their message to their audiences. But as I say, hopefully one of these days they're going to find a suitable home, which will be a permanent place for them to be shown. Any volunteers, in other words.
Beth asks, your subway photographer, was it exhibited in New York? It would have been amazing if someone had spotted their portrait.
Well, I've got a little story about that, because the photographer had it on show in one of my exhibitions in my studio here, and a lady came in and she pointed to one of the portraits and she said, "Is that me?" And she took off her mask and it was very like her. And I said, "Well, not unless you were in New York." And she said, I spent time in New York 2 years ago. And I thought, well, stranger things have happened, you know. It is a small world, and it was very like her. So I like to think that we actually crossed paths on the New York subway a couple of years before that.
Lovely. Suzanne knows this is a sort of a how long is a piece of string question, but how long does it take you to engrave a piece? And I think for the purpose of this question, she suggests, and it's a good suggestion, that we think about one of those portrait roundels. So for maybe the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, because it's about that size, isn't it?
Yes. Well, first of all, you have to remember you have to do your drawing.
So after the drawing.
Some people come to exhibitions and go, you know, I have some drawings on show, and they go, I didn't know you could draw as well. But the fact is, if you can't draw it, you can't engrave it. You see, Peter Dreiser, who is one of the doyens of glass engraving, always used to say that if you can't draw it, you can't engrave it. So once you've got your drawing ready, the actual technical side of it, I would have spent a couple of weeks on one of those portraits. It takes a long time, and you have to do it very carefully, especially if you're trying to catch a likeness. So, and especially when you're working with flashed glass, if you take the flash off, the color's gone, you know. So you have to progress very gently and very carefully. And in fact, occasionally, when it came down to some of the very fine flash, I ended up rubbing the carborundum with my finger rather than even with a wheel. So it's a slow process, and I'm afraid that's why wheel engraving is now on the endangered list of crafts, because it's too slow for any commercial companies. It's being kept alive by us few artist engravers, but you can see it's got a lot of potential for expressing oneself. But you do have to have a certain mindset. I think you have to enjoy the meditative pace of it. But I'm happy just to sit, you know, at my workbench and engrave all day if I get the chance.
Welcome back, Alison. And I just was sharing with our participants upcoming talks that we have. But since you're back, I will continue to ask my question, which was about the display of your works in these exhibitions. I was really taken with the backdrops that you provide, those big, large photographs, and also thinking about the lighting and how many of your works are kind of quite long works, and there's a kind of cinematography feel to the whole thing, a bit theatrical, and wondered if that was something that you were especially interested in. Obviously, with a church window, you've got that context that's kind of fixed, but maybe it's a bit more playful for you in an exhibition context.
Well, I think so. I mean, the backdrops, you know, I usually design them as fabric, either painted or printed with photographic, and they can be hung behind them. And that's mostly just being practical, you know, because fabric is reasonably easy to hang up. So you don't have to provide huge screens behind things, you know. But then it means is predictable from my point of view. You don't have your work exhibited against exit signs or fire hydrants, this sort of thing. So I do like the idea that you can sort of read along things. It's kind of like telling a story almost. And then some of my work has involved music as well. So it's kind of a progression as well. And it's wonderful to be able to just to take these things further. You know, one image kind of leads on to another. That's what I found when I was doing the long ones. And I found that sort of voyage along it is good for me as well as for a viewer.
And I suppose one of the other things that's noticeably different to kind of traditional stained glass windows is that your pieces have a front and back and can be viewed from both sides and all round, whereas a stained glass window is designed to be viewed from only one side.
Well, yes, usually these panels, the long panels that I do, are just designed to be seen from one side.
Okay.
We did actually think about when I discovered how beautiful the shadows were. we discussed trying to shine light through them, as some people do very successfully with engraved glass, and project an image onto the wall. But I decided that it was actually much safer to photograph the shadow and print it and have it as a permanent record, because then you don't have the problems about showing it in museums where, you know, the lighting isn't right, or it's difficult to get positioning for things, and then people pass in between the light and the shadows, and yeah, it's just much more difficult. But so on the whole, these the panels are actually designed just to be seen from one viewed. You know, my three-dimensional pieces are they could be viewed from either side, and they're equally successful. You see different things in them because of the reflections.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, unless any other questions have popped up, which I don't think they have, on behalf of all of us, Alison, thank you so much for sharing this ancient technique and, as you said, an art form and practice that's under threat today. Very few people practicing it, so we feel really privileged to hear from you, and everyone has said so. I will make sure you get the comments because they're all overwhelmingly positive, and thank you
nice.
for sharing your information about your artwork and this amazing technique of glass engraving, predominantly with a wheel engraver. So thank you, Alison.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to talk to everyone.
And thank you all of you for joining us. I'll end by sharing the screen of our next 2 talks in the series, and hope to see you again later this month. Thank you, everybody.